I never thought I'd find myself writing something like this. Even now, as I type these words, it feels like I'm trapped in someone else's nightmare, but this is my life. Every painful, gut-wrenching detail of it. Yeah, it's about my wife, or maybe I should say my ex-wife. It's not something I'm proud to share, but here we are. Let me be clear. I'm not some wild, reckless guy. I've got a steady job, and most people would describe me as calm, the kind of person who doesn't let much get to him, but jealousy, that's always been my weak spot. It's like this quiet shadow, just waiting for something to stir it up. If only I trusted that feeling sooner, I might have avoided this mess. So let me tell you about her, my wife, the woman who could make any man lose his mind from the moment we met. She had this pull, this magnetic energy that was impossible to ignore. She was gorgeous. The kind of beauty that makes you stop scrolling on Instagram just to stare for a moment. But it wasn't just her looks. She had this confidence, this fiery presence that made you want to chase her even when some part of you knew better. That energy of hers? At first, it was intoxicating. She liked to take charge, to be the one in control. In the beginning, it felt exciting, even sexy. I mean, who doesn't love a little challenge? But over time, that same intensity started to feel like a weight. Her stubbornness, it wore me down faster than I ever expected. We met at a friend's party. One of those nights you show up to with no expectations. And then she walked in, commanding the room like she owned it. I couldn't look away from her. We hit it off right away, sparks flying everywhere, and before long we were inseparable. A few years later we got married. That's when things started to shift. It wasn't all at once, just little things at first. Tiny cracks I chose to ignore. But looking back now, I can see how blind I was. Her career was the first sign. She'd always bounce from one job to another, never really finding her footing. At the time, she worked in marketing, a mid-level position at some company that didn't seem to appreciate her. Then one day, she came home and announced she had quit. Just like that. She said she was done working for people who didn't value her, and while I backed her up, I told her to take her time and figure out what would make her happy. What I didn't expect was for that something to be Instagram. She already had an account, but it was nothing big. Just some casual photos of vacations, a few outfits, nothing special. But when she quit her job, she threw herself into it like it was her new career. She started posting constantly, every little thing from following trends to sharing personal moments from our lives. First, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was harmless. It gave her something to focus on while she figured out her next step, and we weren't struggling financially, so I let it go. Honestly, I thought it was a phase she'd get bored of, but it wasn't. Her follower count started to grow slowly at first, just a few 100, then 1,000, and then tens of 1,000. Suddenly, people were stopping her in public like she was some kind of celebrity. Looking back, I should have seen the signs then, but I didn't. I was too trusting, too naive. I actually encouraged her to keep going. I thought, if this makes her happy, why not? Besides, we had enough savings to fall back on if it didn't work out. What I didn't realize was how much that shallow, attention-driven world would take over her life. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It became her identity. First, I was proud of her. She was getting sponsorships, free products, and even paid posts. I didn't fully understand how it all worked, but I was happy to see her passionate about something. But as time went on, she became glued to her phone. Every conversation revolved around her followers. Her next post, her brand, and the selfies. Don't even get me started on the endless selfies. Living with her felt like living with a wannabe Kardashian. We started to drift apart. Intimacy between us became rare, and whenever I tried to bring it up, she'd brush me off, saying she was too tired or had an early meeting for a collaboration. First, I believed her. I told myself it was just a phase, something we'd work through, and everything would get back to normal, but it never did. Now looking back, I can't believe how blind I was. I was so focused on being the supportive, understanding husband that I completely missed the signs. She wasn't just building her Instagram career. She was creating a life that didn't include me. So yeah, that's where we are now, and trust me, it gets messier from here. I'll get to the part about her sister soon enough, but first, let me explain how things spiraled. For a while, her Instagram wasn't really going anywhere. It was like one of those typical vanity projects, posts about our vacations, shopping trips, selfies with that look at me vibe. Sure, she had a decent following, but it wasn't the kind of thing that could pay the bills, if you know what I mean. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed and fast. She started meeting new people, influencers, bloggers, and all those camera-obsessed types. She began attending networking events, which as I later realized was just a fancy way of saying she was hanging out with other attention seekers. First, I didn't think much of it. She said it was all about learning how to grow her page and understand algorithms. I didn't know how much of that was true, but the growth was undeniable. Her follower count shot up like someone had flipped a switch, and while I probably should have questioned it, I didn't. I was happy for her, proud even. I wanted her to succeed, thinking that if she was happy, maybe we'd be happy too. But looking back, I was blind. I should have seen the signs, especially since things between us were only getting worse. Now her family, that's a whole other can of worms. Her parents were old school, conservative, and deeply religious. The kind of people who never missed a Sunday at church and frowned at anything they considered worldly. Naturally, they hated the idea of their daughter plastering her life all over social media for strangers to see. But my wife, she didn't care about their opinions. She never had, especially not theirs. Her sister, though, was a different story. She was nothing like my wife. Calm, reserved, and grounded. Honestly, she reminded me a lot of myself. If my wife was a firecracker, her sister was a quiet, steady candle. She didn't buy into the flashy Instagram lifestyle or the recklessness my wife seemed to dive in head first. And yeah, I found myself wondering more than once how these two could even be related. They were polar opposites. The first real red flag came when my wife started posting swimsuit photos. Now, I get it. The occasional beach pic is normal, right? But this wasn't just casual. She started booking professional photo shoots, all dolled up, looking like she was trying to land the cover of some high-end magazine. It wasn't fun or spontaneous anymore. It was calculated, and honestly, it made me uncomfortable. But I didn't say anything. I told myself it was her account, her body, her choice. At first, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. But then things started getting weird. Expensive items began showing up around the house, brand, new furniture designer, clothes, luxury handbags, you name it. And these weren't small purchases. These were the kind of things that cost a fortune. I knew I hadn't given her money for them. At first, I thought maybe she dipped into our savings or found a way to make extra cash from her blog. So I asked her about it. She just shrugged it off and said it was all from her influencer gigs. Now I'm no fool. I've seen how the influencer game works, and I knew she wasn't getting enough brand deals to afford all that stuff. So where was it coming from? I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through her Instagram, combing through every post, every caption, looking for anything. Sponsored content, partnerships, ads, anything that might explain the sudden influx of money, but I came up empty. Not a single sponsored post. No partnerships. No ads. Nothing. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I had more questions than answers, and the worst part, I had no idea how to bring it up without her flipping out. No matter how hard I tried to figure it out on my own, I couldn't connect the dots. Where was the money coming from? What was happening behind the scenes? I didn't know who to trust, and I couldn't confront her without risking an explosion. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. I used to think PIs were just a Hollywood trope. Guys in trench coats, working out of shady offices and tailing people in beat-up cars for cheap fees. Turns out it's nothing like that. It's expensive. Very expensive. But at that point, I didn't care. I needed answers. If it cost more than I expected, so be it. I had to know what was really going on with my wife, where all this money was coming from, and if there was something shady behind her sudden Instagram fame. I'll admit I felt uneasy about hiring a private investigator, like I was crossing some kind of invisible line. But then again, if my wife wasn't hiding anything, what did I have to worry about? That's how I justified it to myself, at least. The detective didn't waste any time. He was all business. No questions. No chit-chat. He promised to dig into her activities, look for any suspicious meetings, transactions, or patterns that didn't add up. While I waited for him to do his thing, my mind kept circling back to one other person who might help her sister. I hadn't talked to her about any of this before, but she was calm and level-headed. The kind of person who seemed to have a steady perspective on life. If anyone might know something, or at least point me in the right direction, it was her. So one evening, I decided to pay her a visit. I didn't want to make it obvious, so I played it off as a casual stop by just a brother-in-law dropping in for a friendly chat. When I got there, it was quiet, just her in the house. She seemed surprised to see me, but she welcomed me in. We sat in her living room sharing a bottle of wine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange kind of calm. She had this way of making things feel manageable even when I knew deep down they weren't. At first, we stuck to small talk, easy topics to fill the air, but eventually, I had to bring up why I was really there. I told her I was worried about my wife, how she'd been acting strange, and how I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I'm sure she could tell I was on edge. Honestly, I was terrified. I didn't know if my wife had gotten involved with the wrong crowd or was hiding something dangerous. Maybe I was just paranoid, but after everything that had been happening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Her sister listened quietly, her face serious, but not shocked. When I asked if she knew anything at all, she shook her head. She said my wife hadn't shared anything personal with her, and that they weren't as close as they used to be. They'd grown apart over the years, she explained, and my wife rarely opened up about her private life anymore. Still, she promised me that if she ever noticed anything or heard something concerning, she'd let me know. It was a frustrating conversation. I left her house with no more answers than I'd come in with. But at least I felt like I had someone on my side. Her sister was the calm, rational one. The kind of person you turn to when everything else is falling apart. But even with her reassurance, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something huge, something awful was on the horizon. When the detective finally called me back to meet, my stomach was in knots. The entire drive to his office, I felt this heavy sense of dread. I knew without him saying a word that whatever he'd found wasn't going to be good. And when I walked in and saw the serious look on his face, no pleasantries, no preamble, I knew I was right. He didn't waste time. He sat me down, pulled out a folder, and said, "Your wife's Instagram." That's just the surface. My heart dropped, but I didn't interrupt. I needed to hear everything. It's a front. He said a platform for her real source of income. Then he said the name of the site, and it felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I won't name it here, but it was one of those sites, the type flashy, provocative, where women post explicit photos and videos for money. The kind that makes a fortune if you know how to play the game. I just sat there stunned, trying to process what he was telling me. My wife, the woman who had convinced me she was building a legitimate influencer career, was making money from something like this. The detective laid it all out in front of me. Screenshots of her profile on the site, payment records linked directly to her bank account, even schedules for professional photo shoots. These weren't just Instagram-style photos. They were far more revealing, sensual shots taken with precision and purpose. This wasn't about fashion or lifestyle. It was about selling herself. I flipped through the document slowly, my heart pounding with each page. The detective just sat there watching me, saying nothing. The more I looked, the more it hit me. She had been living a double life, building this secret career while I had no clue. Sure, she told me about photo shoots and working hard on content, but I thought it was all for Instagram. Just part of the influencer hustle. But no, this wasn't about gaining followers or landing brand deals. This was about profiting off men paying for exclusive provocative content. Then it all clicked. The expensive furniture, the designer clothes, the luxury bags piling up at home. They weren't from Instagram sponsorships. They were from this. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, betrayal, confusion. They all hit me at once. Some guys might have shrugged it off, maybe even justified it, saying, well, it's not physical cheating, but not me. To me, this was a betrayal in every sense of the word. It wasn't just about what she was doing. It was the lies, the secrecy, the fact that she'd been selling herself online without ever talking to me about it. I felt like I didn't even know who she was anymore. I wasn't just her husband anymore. I was the fool left in the dark while she put herself on display for God knows how many men. The detective leaned forward, snapping me out of my daze. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone heavy with sympathy. It wasn't an apology for anything he'd done, but for the weight of what he knew I was grappling with. "I know this isn't easy," he added gently. I nodded, still numb. I should have seen it. I muttered more to myself than to him. All those photo shoots, the endless new clothes and bags she'd bring home claiming it was part of the job. I never imagined it was anything like this. We all miss things, the detective said, trying to offer some comfort. Sometimes people are just good at hiding who they really are, but I couldn't shake it. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she come to me and at least explain what she was doing? Maybe she thought I'd blow up, or Maybe she was scared of what I'd say, but still something. I kept thinking that if we talked about it, maybe things would have been different. Maybe she wouldn't have felt the need to hide it, or maybe we would have split up long ago, and I wouldn't be sitting in this office feeling like my entire world had crumbled beneath me. My mind went back to all those times when things had started to shift. The more revealing photos, the frequent photo shoots, the luxury items piling up. Every single one of those signs now made perfect, terrible sense. Those weren't just innocent Instagram posts. They were content for paying customers. I took the folder from the detective, my hands trembling as I opened it. Everything was there. Photos, transaction records, even messages between her and men I didn't know. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a life I didn't recognize, a double life she'd been living right under my nose. I flipped through the pages slowly, my heart pounding harder with each one. These weren't just snapshots for Instagram. They were professional, calculated, and far more revealing than anything she'd ever posted publicly. This wasn't about fashion or lifestyle. It was about selling herself, and she'd kept it from me. The detective didn't say a word. He just sat back watching me absorb the reality. The more I saw, the harder it hit. She had been living this secret life while I was clueless. All the time she told me about shoots and content creation, I thought it was for Instagram, part of the influencer hustle. But no, this was something entirely different, something I never could have imagined. I left the detective's office that day with more answers than I'd ever wanted. The folder in my hands felt like it weighed a ton. My head was spinning, my stomach churning. There was no way I could confront her. Not right then. Not with the storm of anger and confusion swirling inside me. I needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone not tangled up in her lies. The only person I could think of was her sister. Without calling, I drove straight to her house. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, I think she could tell something was wrong. Her face softened into concern, and she stepped aside. "Come in," she said quietly. I walked in clutching the folder, knowing that what I was about to say would shatter any illusions she might still have about her sister. We sat down in her living room, just like we had the other night. But this time, I wasn't here for casual advice. I was here to drop a bombshell. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Slowly, I told her everything about the detective, the website, the photos, the money. At first, she just stared at me frozen, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then her expression shifted. Disgust, confusion, maybe even sadness. I pulled out the folder and placed it on the table between us. "This," I said, my voice cracking. "This is what she's been doing." She hesitated, then opened it. Her eyes scanned the photos, the transactions, the schedules for what felt like forever. She said nothing. Finally, she pushed it away and whispered. I had no idea. Her voice was barely audible, and I could tell she was struggling to process it. "I can't believe she's doing this." I muttered, my head in my hands. Everything was crashing down around me. I couldn't think clearly. My mind raced, trying to figure out what my next move should be, but nothing made sense. She stood up and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of wine from the counter. "Here," she said, pouring us both a glass. "You need this." I took the glass, grateful for anything that might dull the edges of the chaos in my head. She sat back down, and for a while she tried to steer the conversation toward other things. Work, life, anything but the truth that was tearing me apart. Honestly, I was thankful for the distraction, even if just for a moment. It felt like a tiny breath of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. Still, her support meant more than I could express. She didn't judge me or make me feel stupid for missing the signs. She was just there, steady and calm, and that meant everything. When it was time to leave, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this as I thought. As I went to say goodbye, I leaned in for a hug. Something simple, familiar, a gesture of thanks and comfort. But when she hugged me back, it wasn't just friendly. She wrapped her arms around me tightly, holding on like she didn't want to let go. And I'm not going to lie, there was something about it, something warm. For the first time in days, I felt comforted. It wasn't the hug of a family member. It lingered longer than it should have. Friendly hugs don't last that long, do they? At the time, I tried to convince myself it was just two people caught in a bad situation, offering each other support. But the way her body pressed against mine, the way her breath slowed against my shoulder, it felt different. I didn't know what to make of that hug. Maybe I didn't want to, but one thing was clear: it was the start of something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. 2 days later, the dinner I'd been dreading finally arrived. It had been planned for weeks. A family gathering at our place with her parents, her sister, and of course my wife. The last thing I wanted was to sit at a table pretending everything was fine, but I decided to hold off on confronting her until then. If I was going to blow up our lives, I figured I might as well do it with a bang. I still didn't know exactly how I was going to handle it. Part of me wanted to pull her aside, confront her privately, and get it over with. But another part of me thought, why make it easy for her? She'd been hiding this from me for months, maybe even longer. Her family, especially her conservative religious parents, deserved to know the truth about who their daughter had become. The atmosphere at dinner was tense for me, at least. Everyone else was chatting, making small talk, but I could barely sit still. Her dad was asking me polite questions about work. Her mom was inquiring about our lives like we were the picture-perfect couple, and my wife. She played the part flawlessly, smiling, laughing, acting like nothing was wrong. It was almost impressive how effortlessly she pretended our world wasn't on the verge of collapsing. About halfway through dinner, her sister mentioned how successful my wife's career had become. She sounded proud, beaming about how far my wife had come. That was my cue. I cleared my throat, keeping my tone casual. I began. It really is incredible how much she's accomplished lately. Truly impressive. I glanced at my wife. Her smile faltered just slightly, but it was enough for me to notice. Her career's really taken an unexpected turn, I added, letting the words hang in the air, just long enough to make everyone at the table uneasy. Her parents looked at me, curious but clueless. Her sister gave me a cautious glance, remembering the conversation we'd had before. My wife, though, was starting to look pale, as if she knew exactly where this was going. I continued, leaning back in my chair. She's done an amazing job balancing her life as a social media influencer and her other endeavors. Silence, thick and suffocating. My wife's face drained of color. Her parents furrowed their brows, confused, while her sister shifted uncomfortably in her seat. And since we're all here tonight, I said, my voice deceptively calm, I thought it might be a good time to show you exactly what she's been up to. I pulled out my phone, opened the browser, and navigated straight to her profile on that site. The one where she'd been posting the photos, the real source of her income. Without a word, I turned the screen toward her parents. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mom's expression twisted from confusion to horror in an instant. Her dad's jaw dropped, but no words came out. He just stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing, and then all hell broke loose. Her mom was the first to shout, demanding to know how she could do this, what kind of life she'd been living behind their backs. Her dad tried to stay composed, but his voice quickly rose, a mix of disbelief and fury. My wife looked like she might pass out. She stammered out excuses, trying to explain herself, but nothing she said landed. She was caught, and there was no talking her way out of it. Her sister stayed quiet, her eyes darting between me and the chaos unfolding at the table. She didn't seem to know whose side to take, and the yelling only grew louder. I stood up, calmly took off my jacket, and said, I'm going to head out. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. My voice cut through the shouting just long enough for everyone to hear me. I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my keys and walked out, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. For the first time all evening, I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't angry anymore, just drained. I drove to a nearby bar, the one I used to visit with friends before life got so complicated. I found a seat, ordered a drink, and let the low of the place fill the silence in my head. For the first time in days, I felt like I could finally breathe. About 20 minutes into my second drink, just as the alcohol started dulling the chaos I'd unleashed, she walked in, my wife's sister. I didn't expect her to show up, but as soon as she slid onto the stool next to me, it felt strangely natural, like she belonged there, like this was where she was supposed to be. She didn't say anything at first, just quietly waved the bartender over. I'll have what he's having, she said, her voice soft but steady. I glanced at her, our eyes meeting for a moment longer than they probably should have. There was something there, something unspoken, neither of us willing to acknowledge it yet. But we both felt it, the weight of everything that had just happened, the mess we were now tangled in together. We started with small talk, pretending the elephant in the room didn't exist. It was easier that way, at least for a little while. She asked about work, about how I was holding up. Her voice carried an undertone, though like she knew we were skirting around the inevitable. I answered her questions, but my mind wasn't really on the conversation. I kept noticing things about her. How calm and composed she was, how different she seemed from her sister, grounded, steady, everything my wife wasn't. As the hours passed and the drinks kept flowing, it became clearer and clearer. This wasn't just a casual chat between in-laws. There was something more beneath the surface, something neither of us wanted to admit, but we both knew it was there. I hadn't expected it, but I couldn't deny it either. Being with her made me feel at ease in a way I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. The tension I'd been carrying, the stress of my marriage, the weight of all the lies that seemed to slip away as we talked, and then somewhere in the middle of the night, she reached over and took my hand. Her touch was soft, familiar, and comforting, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Do you want to go for a walk?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. I hesitated for just a moment, but deep down I already knew my answer. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go." We stepped outside into the cool night air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt calm. The city around us was quieter than usual, and we walked side by side in silence, letting the stillness settle over us. After a while, we started to talk. She told me how hard it had been to watch me and her sister fall apart, how she'd noticed the distance between us long before I did. She wasn't judgmental, just honest, and I appreciated that more than I could put into words. As we walked, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel tense around her. I wasn't on edge bracing for the next fight or excuse. Instead, I felt lighter, more alive, like a younger version of myself before life became so heavy. That feeling had been absent for years, not just with my wife, but with anyone. Before I knew it, we were standing at her door. The walk had flown by, and there we were. She turned to me, her voice soft but inviting. "Do you want to come inside?" I didn't need to think about it. "Yeah," I said, stepping inside after her. Her place was quiet, peaceful. The kind of peace I hadn't felt in my own home for what felt like forever. She opened a bottle of wine, something she said she'd been saving for a special occasion, and we sat on her couch talking about everything and nothing all at once. The tension between us was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't oppressive. It hummed in the air, waiting for us to acknowledge it. At some point, I lost track of the conversation entirely. We just looked at each other, sharing a moment of unspoken understanding. It wasn't planned, but it felt natural, like the next step in something that had been building for a long time. In that moment, the chaos of my life seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in years. That night was intense, but it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. It felt like every emotion I'd been bottling up, every ounce of frustration, loneliness, and pain finally had a chance to spill out. She made me feel alive again, and I didn't want it to stop. I stayed at her place that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I didn't regret it, not for a second. This wasn't about revenge or getting back at my wife. It was about something real, something new. When I got home, my wife was waiting for me at the door like she'd been standing there for hours. The second I stepped inside, she slapped me hard across the face. The sting was sharp, but it didn't hurt nearly as much as everything that had led us to this point. "You're a fool." She spat, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think I didn't know where you were? You think I care? I'm filing for divorce." I didn't react. If anything, I felt relieved. She had saved me the trouble of bringing it up myself. "Good," I said, my voice calm. "That's probably the smartest thing you've said in a while." The divorce was surprisingly smooth. No drawn-out battles, no fights over who got what. We both knew it was over, and neither of us had the energy to drag it out. 2 months later, her sister and I sat down with her parents to tell them the truth. We braced ourselves for anger or disgust, but to our surprise, they were supportive. Somehow, they saw something in us that I hadn't been able to see earlier. They understood we were making something good out of the wreckage. As for my ex-wife, she didn't waste any time. She threw herself even deeper into her social media world, embracing it with more enthusiasm than ever. Without me around to question her choices or criticize her priorities, she was free to live however she wanted, and she thrived. Her followers skyrocketed, her content got more attention, and by all accounts, she seemed happy. But I didn't care. It wasn't my problem anymore. I had moved on to something real, something that made me feel alive, and I never looked back. It's been about 2.5 years since everything fell apart, and life has changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. First of all, yes, I got married again to my ex-wife's sister. Still feels strange to say that out loud, but it's the truth. We tied the knot a little over a year ago. It wasn't a big, flashy wedding, just a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends. After all the drama we've been through, a quiet celebration felt right, and there's more we're expecting. Yeah, we're having a baby. Sometimes it still doesn't feel real. Funny how life works. If you told me back when all this chaos started that I'd be starting a family with her, I would have thought you were insane. But here we are preparing for the next big chapter of our lives, and I couldn't be happier. As for how things are going, honestly, they're amazing. We've built a life together that's stable, peaceful, and completely free of drama. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. There are no secrets, no lies, just the two of us tackling life's challenges together, and that's all I ever really wanted. As for my ex, I hear she's still thriving in her social media career. She's living her life, and by all accounts, she seems happy. We don't keep in touch, and I don't see a reason to. We've both moved on, and that's where it ends. To everyone who's followed along with my story, thank you. It's been a roller coaster, but I'm grateful for where it's taken me. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life has a way of working itself out even when it feels completely broken. So to anyone out there going through their own struggles, keep moving forward. You never know where life will take you. Thanks again for your support. Take care.